So yeah, my grandmother's family came from an acting family filled with performers and jobbing stage actors, which leads me to this. What is the history of Edinburgh's theatres? Edinburgh has a bit of a pedigree with the performing arts, what with the festival and such, but I want to concentrate on the theatres themselves rather than, say, what was played on them. But don't worry, there are plenty of very interesting stories, so come with me as we talk about Edinburgh's theatres. Now, the first built theatre was technically on Crubber's Close. That was the first place in Scotland built for the performance of plays in 1736, and was closed in 1737 after protests and opposition from the religious leadership of the day, because back then, theatres were seen as cesspools of vice and degenerate behaviour. Just like my bedroom. However, I want to throw a spanner in the works and suggest that Crubber's Close was not the first theatre in Edinburgh, and it was in reality here. Actually, not here, behind the current theatre. This is Greenside, a hollow between what is today Piccadilly Place and Carlton Hill, and it was here, I would argue, was the first theatre in Edinburgh. Why? Well, here was a natural amphitheatre where jousting, tournaments and plays were put on, including the first public performance of the morality play, a satire of the Free Estates. If you haven't heard of this play, don't worry. It was a play written around 1540 by Sir David Lindsay, who took aim at the Free Estates represented in the Parliament of Scotland, the Lord Spiritual, the Lord Temporal and the merchants. The more things change, the more things stay the same. It was also the first play to use the word fuck. That's right, the first time anyone used the word fuck was in a Scots language play. Nobody had used the word fuck in the play before this point. I'm drawing this out so I can say the word fuck over and over. It was first played in private at Cooper in 1540, but in 1552 it had its first public performance here, in what is now the back of the playhouse. This play was performed a whole 12 years before William Shakespeare was even born. Maybe we should put on a performance of this play down here, just for old time's sake. So, in the latter half of the 18th century, theatre went from something that was quite a seedy affair to something that posh people wanted to go and watch. It was at this point that Shakespeare started to become more and more popular, and this new reputation of theatre didn't fly past Edinburgh despite the 1737 closure of the Crubber's Close Theatre. The Theatre Royal opened in 1769, and just to stress the popularity of Shakespeare, the square in the back was named Shakespeare Square, and hang on a second, we've been here before. Twice in fact. First to talk about Dingwall's Castle and then the Boar Club. Anyway, the theatre was opened by one David Ross, a famous actor and manager in his own right, and it was a grand display of the newly found respectability theatre had found being placed right at the bottom of Princes Street. No longer was theatre to preserve the back streets and closes, it was now a place to be seen. It went through many managers, including Harriet Pye Eston for a while. I comment on this because you don't usually see women getting such high-profile roles in 1792. Anyway, its heyday was between 1815 and 1850, with a big rebuilding happening in 1830. It was demolished in 1859 to make way for the General Post Office, but that is not the end of the story. The title of Theatre Royal was later transferred to a theatre in what was then Broughton Street and what is now the pedestrianised area outside of St Mary's Cathedral. And yes, that used to be part of Broughton Street. It was where the extension of the cathedral is today, and it had a dramatic history, excuse the pun. It burnt down thrice and was rebuilt in 1865, 1875 and 1884. Victorian theatres had a habit of burning down. They don't call theatre curtains safety curtains for nothing. Its final destruction was by, guess what, fire, which happened in 1946. And the big reason why it was never rebuilt was because of wartime material shortages. talking of burning theatres, let's talk about something that sounds like the beginning of a ghost story. Now, while visiting the Craigentinny Marbles for a video, I came across a grave with the Great Lafayette on it and no other context. But before I get into the event, I would just like to address my fellow millennials. Hello millennials! How is the resignation that you will never have the same standard of life as your parents? Do you remember that episode of the Powerpuff Girls where the mayor recalls watching a man brutally die on stage as a child? Well, that kind of happened. Kinda. So let's talk about the Great Lafayette. The Great Lafayette was born in 1871 in Munich as Sigmund Neuberger. He was one of the highest paid magicians of the time, and he was a contemporary of and admired by Harry Houdini, who gifted him a dog named Beauty. He absolutely adored this dog and pampered him with his own room at the theatres that he performed in. Soon after arriving in Edinburgh, his beloved dog Beauty died, and he arranged to have the dog buried in Pearshill Cemetery under the condition that he too be buried there upon his death, which would come in handy because he would die in Edinburgh. So on the 9th of May 1911 at the Empire Theatre, now the Festival Theatre, while performing one of his famous tricks, a lantern set fire to the stage. People didn't evacuate quickly because they thought it was all part of the act, and only moved when the orchestra started playing God Save the King. The side doors were secured to prevent the escape of a lion used in the trick. Yes, you heard me right, making escape even harder. Lafayette escaped but came back in an attempt to save a horse in the theatre, but sadly he never emerged and died in the blaze. After the fire, a body was discovered and identified as the Great Lafayette. This was not Lafayette's body. While clearing the wreckage, they found Lafayette's actual body in the understage and realised the body that they sent to the crematorium was in fact Lafayette's body double that he would use in his magic shows. I wish I was making this up. So Lafayette, after what was basically his last unintended magic trick, would be sent to be cremated in Glasgow and brought back to Edinburgh, where his remains would be carried through the city, witnessed by a crowd of 250,000 apparently, to be laid to rest in the burial plot with his beloved Canon companion, Beauty. Okay, so for the most part, the type of theatre people usually go to now is not the stage kind, but the film kind, the cinema. I might do a thing about Edinburgh's cinematic history at some point, but right now I want to ask the question, what was Edinburgh's first cinema? Google wants you to believe it's the Cameo, but this is merely Edinburgh's oldest cinema. Edinburgh's first cinema is going to be a little bit more complicated. So in the early days of cinema, films were not shown at dedicated theatres, but were often shown at traditional theatres, usually as a part of a larger performance. The first time a projectionist was recorded as a job in Scotland was in 1901, which was certainly before Edinburgh first had a cinema. Usually they would be played as part of a variety of performance as a short silent film, but we also have some early documentary footage. One interesting thing people used to do was stick a camera operator onto the front of a train and have the cinematographer film the journey, like this footage made in 1897 of a train crossing the Tay Bridge. Just for context, this was 7 years after the opening of the Forth Rail Bridge. We even have film footage of Queen Victoria's funeral, which would have been shown all over Britain, so people who couldn't have gone to London could at least have seen the funeral. The Empire Theatre played host to the first ever screening of a film in 1896. The film was The Departure of the Columbia from Rothesay Pier. Incidentally, it was also the first Scottish film, which was exactly what it said on the tin. Imagine if movies were named like that today. We would have films like Smackheads in Edinburgh, Why You Shouldn't Leave Your Exiled Superhumans Unmonitored for 18 Years, and These Stereotypes Weren't Even Acceptable in 1997, how the fuck did they make it into a children's book, let alone a movie? Anyway, enough dilly-dallying. Let's talk about the first cinema in Edinburgh. The first cinema in Edinburgh was here. Well, it was here. This was the site of the North British Electric Theatre, which opened in 1903, 11 years before the Cameo. It renamed itself to the Cinema House in 1911 and apparently competed with its competition by offering free afternoon teas. It closed in 1930, and after becoming a Salvation Army citadel, it was demolished in 2004. Maybe I'll do a video on Edinburgh cinematic history soon. But either way, thank you for watching this little film about Edinburgh and theatre. I will see you next month.